Thank you so much. How many of you are iOS developers? Very quickly. There we go. So, and Android. How many of you do Android development as well? Okay. Well, I'm going to, of course, mention a little bit of Android as well. First of all, thanks very much. Thank you very much to the MC team for organizing the conference. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm half Polish technically. My blood is half Polish. My grandfather and my grandmother were born in Mrącza, so for me it's very special to come to speak to you here in Warsaw. It's really a special moment for me, so thank you so much. So yeah, we're going to talk about 10 years of the iPhone. So this is, it's happening these days. We are going to go back in time. We're going to look a little bit at how the whole platform came to be. And if I remember well, it all started out in 2007. In 2007, I spent Christmas 2006 and New Year 2007 in Madrid. My brother-in-law lives there, and I was in the airport when I got the news of the announcement of the iPhone. Oh, sorry, may I have audio here? There we go.
These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. And here it is.
So this is where it all started, right? This is basically what was going on January 2007 in San Francisco. There was the introduction of this device, and there was a lot of buzz about it on the industry. And it turns out that among the people that were invited to this talk, there was Alan Kay. And Alan Kay had been quoted by Newsweek at some point. He was asked about the Mac in 1984, and Alan Kay famously said that the Mac was the first computer worth criticizing. So at the end of the keynote of Steve Jobs in 2007, Steve Jobs asked him, "Is this phone worth criticizing?" And as Alan Kay famously told him, "Make this 5 by 8 inches and you're going to rule the world." So really interesting. Now, not everybody was very positive about the iPhone.
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
This is what smartphones were all about. Smartphones were email machines back then, okay? Let us be very clear. This is how it all started. Steve Jobs actually had a broader vision about this whole new family of devices, and he called them post-PC devices.
But then there's an explosion that's starting to happen in these, what you call post-PC devices, right? And you call the iPod one of them. There's a lot of things that are not...
You can get into trouble for using that term. I want you to know that.
What?
I'm kidding. Post-PC devices.
Why?
People write letters to the editor. They complain about it. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay. Well, anyway, I think there's just a category of devices that aren't as general purpose, they're really more focused on specific functions, whether they're phones or iPods or Zunes or what have you. And I think that category of devices is going to continue to be very innovative, and we're going to see lots of them.
Give me an example of what that would be.
Well, an iPod is a post-PC device. A phone is a post-PC device.
There you go. We are going beyond the PC, and it's very telling. It's a very telling story that this was told right beside Bill Gates in their last recorded meeting in public relations history. And what interested me the most about the announcement of the iPhone was that the machine was said to be running a modified version of OS X. So in my geek mind, that meant that somehow deep down all of those layers of software, there was Objective-C. And for me, Objective-C was a cool thing. I bought my first Mac in 2002 just to be able to use Project Builder, and I taught myself Objective-C while I was a .NET developer by day. Okay, so it was a very big deal. Now, it turns out in WWDC 2007, Steve Jobs famously said that the only way you could do applications for the iPhone was using web apps. So thankfully, there was this guy, Joe Hewitt, who was very well known at the time because he had worked in Firefox and Firebug, and he came out with the first mobile web framework for the iPhone called IUI. Some of you might remember this. This is a seminal software that actually inspired a whole generation of mobile web frameworks including Ionic, which is one of the most well-known and one of the latest. Okay, in any case, the iPhone went on sale on June 29th. It was a huge release in the Fifth Avenue store in New York City, and it was a fairly underpowered machine when you think about the specification. It's quite a telling story to see how little specification, how little memory, how slow the CPU was. In any case, and what actually characterized the first iPhone is the things it didn't have. It didn't have 3G, it didn't have applications, it didn't have multitasking, it didn't have copy-paste, push email, push notifications. All of that was not even part of the picture. Around July 2007, I opened an account in this fairly new website called Twitter. I told myself that it might be useful at some point. People were starting to get their first bills in August about the iPhone.
I have an iPhone, and I had to switch to AT&T. Okay, that's wonderful. Well, I got my first AT&T bill. Right here. In a box.
So Justine Zarik, known as iJustine, got her first iPhone bill directly on a box with 300 pages of details of all the communications she had made on her iPhone. So there was a change going on in the industry. Actually, it was a telling story. In September, Apple sold 1 million iPhones already, and Time named it the invention of the year. But people, developers were actually asking for developing native apps. So that's how jailbreak, the term jailbreak came to be. And you have Punished Tool and Cydia, who came really more or less at that time in the iPhone. The pressure was so much that actually Jobs decided to release an official SDK by October, telling that there would be some work to be done, so to be able to publish all of these frameworks to the public. And then we end the year 2007 with Apple making a decent $24 billion in revenue and having sold around 1.1 million iPhones. And we get to 2008, and in 2008, finally, we have the official iPhone SDK who come out. And most importantly, the concept of the App Store. The concept of the App Store including the possibility of Apple of vetoing application. This was something that wasn't heard of in desktop and mobile platforms, but it was very common for consoles. Game consoles, usually game console makers, would veto the games depending on their interest. So basically Apple took a little bit of a cue from Sony and Nintendo in this part. The first and the second movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe were released more or less at that time, Iron Man and Hulk. And WWDC was the first one who sold out in 2008. It sold out actually in 2 months. For the first time, that didn't happen. Steve Jobs announced how many people had installed. There was a lot of interest going on into the iPhone SDK. They were clearly going in the good direction. And Scott Forstall, for the first time, took the decision of spending more or less 3/4 of an hour doing demos in the WWDC, and this is something that lasted for a couple of years. The iPhone OS 2.0 is interesting because of all the things that we consider for granted today in the platforms that weren't there, and this is a couple of them, okay? There was no ARC. You had to release, retain, and auto-release yourself. There was no instruments. Xcode and the Interface Builder were 2 separate apps. There was no auto layout, no storyboards, no map views, no gesture recognizers, okay? All of that didn't exist. There was no core data. Let's be very clear, not even core data. Of course, what we did have was a famous bug in UI image named. For those who remember, it was an image leak, an absolute horrendous image leak, because image named would not release properly the images, and basically you could have Apple-sponsored crashes, so it was very fun. The iPhone 3G was also released in 2008. It was pretty much the same spec as the original iPhone, plus the 3G connectivity and the GPS, which provided the possibility to create location-enabled services. This was a huge thing back then. A guy released a $1,000 I Am Rich app. For those who remember, it lasted for a couple of days. He actually sold around 10 copies, so he made around $10,000 of revenue with this, and then either Apple or the guy took it out. There was a fucking NDA, because basically everything that we learned in 2008 in WDC was under a fucking NDA until the end of September. So we couldn't ask questions in this new website, very cool new website that just came out in the 15th of September 2008 called Stack Overflow. The same day, the Dow Jones crashed 4% because basically one of those banks were betting in the wrong thing. Instead of buying Apple stock, these guys were betting on the housing market. That's how bad it went. I sponsored and I co-organized the first conference about the iPhone, I remember, in October 2009. And in November came out the first book about the iPhone SDK. Many of us have started our careers reading this book by Jeff LaMarche and Dave Mark. GitHub was starting out. I opened an account more or less by that time. It was a fairly new website. It was cool. It was like Google Code, but actually a bit nicer. And you could use Git instead of Subversion, which was good. And then we go to the end of 2008 and see Apple was actually getting much more revenue, like 32 billion. And they were selling lots of iPhones already, like 12 million iPhones accumulated since the previous year. And there were 13,000 apps on the App Store back then. In 2009, Joe Hewitt, once again, goes to the native side and releases 320. For those who remember, 320 is a seminal piece of software. It's one of the first huge libraries of code actually taken from the Facebook application, which provided a lot of functionality in a monolithic way. You either included the whole massive megabyte binary into your application, or you could do nothing at all. So that was a bit of a bummer, but it set the pace for a whole new generation of components. In February, a new company called WhatsApp was set up. You might have heard about it as well. And Palm decided to get into the race, and they released a software called, a platform called WebOS, which was quite cool, and nobody used it. I released a project on GitHub called NIP to Objective-C. I get a little bit of publicity on Ars Technica by Erika Sadun herself. And then 2009, I went to my second WWDC. This time it sold out in just 1 month. And the good thing about iPhone, of that WWDC was the iPhone OS 3.0. And it had many, many features that everybody was expecting from the platform, like, you know, push notifications, core data, new messages. And the iPhone 3GS was finally released as well. It was a huge improvement in terms of hardware, much faster than the previous editions. This iPhone was supported officially until February 2014. It was almost 5 years supported officially by Apple. In November, Luke Wroblewski, another person who could very well be here in Poland any day, wrote the seminal article called Mobile First, changing the way we thought about applications and services for the first time. This is a seminal paper, a seminal article on the web, very important one. At the end of 2009, Apple is still making a lot of money, 36 billion just in the year, and cumulated sale is 33 million devices, and there were already 100,000 apps on the App Store. We reached 2010. In 2010, NBC publishes a documentary on television called Planet of the Apps. So remember the name. It's going to come back later. Of course, Steve Jobs introduces the iPad to the world, and with that, for developers, the good thing is that we had a new interim release of iPhone OS called iPhone OS 3.2 that brought gesture recognizers and universal applications for the first time to the platform, so you could make applications for the iPad and the phone. More or less at the same time, Samsung introduced this thing called Bada. You might have heard about it. Everybody was saying, it's the future. And of course, HP bought Palm, and they announced plans to release tablets and smartphones using WebOS. At that point in time, there was kind of a battle between Adobe and Apple, so Steve Jobs came up with an article called Thoughts About Flash, where basically he explained the logic and the rationale and the technology problems posed by Flash in mobile devices, in post-PC devices. More or less at that time, Adobe wanted to make developers write iPhone apps using Adobe Flash. So basically, Apple added clause 3.3.1 to the developer agreement, which literally blocked all apps not written in C, C++, Objective-C, and JavaScript. It was a huge backlash from the industry, from many developers. Many developers left the industry. There were conferences canceled, like the C4 conference by Wolf Wrench. He canceled. He was a very well-known macOS developer. He canceled his conference because of this. Apple removed this clause in September. Blackberry bought QNX. QNX is a real-time operating system that was very popular in NASA and for making peacemakers. So Blackberry bought it to make smartphones. And the third movie of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was released also in 2010. And this time, WWDC was sold out in just 8 days. This was my third one, I remember. This is the one in which iPhone OS got finally named iOS. And iOS 4 was an incredible release. It was one of the most important, the second one most important being iOS 8. But iOS 4 brought an incredible amount of new features, very important ones, including blocks. And with blocks came Grand Central Dispatch. So these are seminal things, very important ones that were introduced back in 2010. And of course, Retina displays and the famous hack of adding @2x that also comes from 2010. There were a couple of new frameworks for us to play with. Most importantly, let's say probably the quick look, and also iAd. iAd was added, so you could add advertising to your application, officially sanctioned by Apple. A couple of new features for users, of course, as you might expect. The most important announcement, of course, was the iPhone 4. The iPhone 4 was the first one with a front-rear camera. Okay, so you could do FaceTime calls. It was quite a cool feature. It really brought the iPhone to the level of science fiction kind of device, and you could get a Star Trek level of experience with it, finally. This device was supported until June 2014, but it is mostly remembered because of AntennaGate. AntennaGate, depending on how you held your iPhone 4 device, you would totally lose connectivity with your cell tower. Actually, I tried. It did work. So AntennaGate was real. Apple was basically forced to give bumpers to everybody. So I remember getting on the mail a voucher for a bumper, and it was a very weird caoutchouc rubber kind of bumper. Anyway, a guy had the idea of making a photo shoot using an iPhone Sdk.
Hello? Yeah, is Lee there? Yeah, this is Lee.
Oh, hey Lee, this is Ryan calling for Wando High School. What do you say?
I'm really not interested. Thank you very much. I'm in the middle of a photo shoot right now. Yeah, I need my camera back. Thanks.
So basically, that was also something that made a lot of buzz back then. Some open source libraries you might remember, ASI HTTP request, anyone? Before AF networking, and before Coco supported JSON serializing and deserializing, one had to use JSON kits. So this was some of my preferred ones. App was chosen Word of the Year as well by the National Institute of Dictionaries in the United States or something like that. However, the word had been used already by Steve Jobs back in 1989.
Here we are at the Next Computer, and we want to look at two things. The first, of course, is what it's like to actually build a mission-critical app, and we're going to do that here.
So Steve Jobs was already using the app back in the time, the word app back in the time, but it really took off with the iPhone. And there was these guys, they took off this new project called Instagram. You might have heard about it as well. That was more or less in October 2010. By that time, Microsoft came up with their own idea of a smartphone, which was Windows Phone. I don't know if some of you have ever used the Windows Phone. They are quite unusable, in my opinion. But that's history has proven actually me right somehow. But at that time, Google announced famously that they were activating 300,000 devices per day. Android really took off in 2010 and became the real alternative to iPhone, or iPhone became the real alternative to Android, depending on how you look at it. By that time, Apple was making a shitload of money, $65.2 billion. They were selling iPhones like crazy. The total accumulated numbers of iPhones sold by the end of 2010 is 73 million, and there were 300,000 apps on the App Store. And we go to 2011 now, and in 2011 comes the Mac App Store, for good or worse. It is there. It is part of the landscape. It is raising many questions. Basically, the sandboxing feature required by Mac apps is actually raising many questions around developers and, of course, the review process. A developer called Mike Lee in 2011, in January 2011, announced the creation of Amsterdam. Mike Lee was very well known in the medium because he had worked with Delicious Monster and making Delicious Library. Then he made the Obama application, and then he went to Europe. He didn't want to live in the United States anymore. He went to Europe and created this concept called Amsterdam. If you want to make movies, go to Hollywood. If you want to make apps, go to Amsterdam. There was this company called Lotsys. Lotsys was starting to sue developers, individual developers on the App Store because of infringement on patents, okay? This was a huge thing. A lot of very well-known developers got cease and desist letters, and they were taken to court. I don't know exactly what happened. This story has faded into history. Most probably Apple settled down this affair with the company. By April, a company called JetBrains, who's sponsoring this event, came up with the first real alternative to Xcode called AppCode, with put in the hands of developers for the first time actual useful refactoring. The fourth and the fifth movies of the MCU universe came out more or less at that time, and this time WDC 2011 sold out in just 12 hours. The times are accelerating. I don't know if you see the pattern. iOS 5 is known as the CD release. This is the most important feature of iOS 5, if you remember. There were also Newsstand, which basically disappeared a couple of years later, and iMessages, of course. Some other features, most notably iCloud, replacing MobileMe as the core cloud experience for the iPhone. A couple more frameworks for us to play with, like GLKit or Core Image, most notably. But for developers, the most interesting feature was storyboards. Well, I see that the picture that I've chosen doesn't really show, but this is a very big storyboard that you have there, okay? And storyboard brought also the incredible experience of merging storyboards, okay? We all know what it feels like. iAd, which I mentioned started the previous year in 2010, had to lower the standard contract from $500,000, yeah, that's how much it cost you to put ads on iAd, to a mere $300,000 to attract customers. HP finally decided in August that they were not going to do WebOS anymore somehow, and the announcement came 3 weeks after they released their own tablet, so it was a really weird moment. At that time, the iPhone 4S came out. It was really an improvement in terms of hardware. It was the first device with up to 64 gigabytes of storage as well. And more or less by that time, a guy named Eloy Duran started working on what would become eventually CocoaPods before it was taken over then by Orthotherox a couple of years later. In October, Steve Jobs passed away, and his biography by Walter Isaacson was released as well to the press. And so ends 2011 with Apple, the revenues of Apple going literally above the roof, $108 billion, and the accumulated iPhone sales, we are around 146 million, 40 million iPhones and iPads sold, and 500,000 applications on the App Store. In 2012, Objective-C was named Programming Language of the Year. For those who know the TIOBE index, we were very surprised because Objective-C was, for years, a very low in the rankings, like number 120th, and all of a sudden it becomes the third most popular programming language in the platform. The first Retina iPad is released at the beginning of 2012 as well. And iAd has to lower the contract from $100,000 to attract customers. Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion in March 2012, and at the same time, Firefox came up with an idea for a new smartphone platform, another one called Firefox OS, for those who remember. The sixth movie of the Marvel Cinematic Universe came out as well in 2012, and then WDC 2012 sold out in just 1 hour and 43 minutes. This was my last one. I actually have the anecdote that I had to call my bank because I was over limit for my credit card, so I couldn't buy my ticket. The purchase was rejected, and in that hour and a half, I was on the phone with the person from my bank, asking her for a little bit of credit so that I could buy the ticket for WWDC, and then a few seconds later, I see the tweet saying sold out. So it was a hot one, but I got it. I went. This was my fourth WWDC. Not a very interesting one from the point of view of developers. There was nothing really new apart from a few improvements here and there. The most important feature of iOS 6, however, is Maps, of course. Maps that has proven to be the downfall of Scott Forstall, who basically disappeared from the map of iOS ever since. More or less at that time was announced as well iPhone 5. The iPhone 5 was really an improvement in the sense that it was the first device to be released with a screen size that was bigger than the typical 320 x 480 that was the standard since the first iPhone. It's still, today, the oldest device still to support it as we speak. It will not be supported anymore in 10.3.2 because 10.3.2 will remove support for 32-bit devices. More or less at that time, a guy called Matt Thompson started working on AF networking. That was more or less at that year. And we have the iPad mini. And the iPad mini, it's a 5x8 tablet, thereby fulfilling the wishes of you-know-who, Alan Kay. The Retina MacBook Pro was released more or less at that time as well. And very importantly, all of these new devices came out for the first time without the 30-pin Apple dock connector. That was a venerable connector since 2003, since the iPod. And now we have this Lightning. And everybody has to buy new bumpers and new accessories and new connectors because all of the connectors have changed, okay? We start now this sequence, the second sequence here, with Apple making a shitload of money once again, $156 billion of revenue for having sold 271 million iPhones and 98 million iPads. In 2013, once again, Objective-C is once again programming language of the year. That really showed the really strong interest in the whole industry around the iPhone. Objective-C per itself, somehow everybody loved to hate Objective-C, yet it was the official sanctioned method for programming that thing. And 2013, very interestingly, is the year of skeuomorphism. Everybody was hating skeuomorphism and Scott Forstall's tendency to put leather and glass and wood in all the textures of all of your apps on iOS. And that's why there was this trend going on, and we went little by little to minimalism. And we're going to see what's going to give that later. Samsung killed Bada or merged it into Tizen, whatever that all of these things is. Blackberry released BlackBerry 10, but more or less by that time, the founder and the CEO were selling stock from RIM, which is really weird story when you think about it. They really sold everything they had, and they left the company before it all went down. The 7 and 8 movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe were released, Iron Man 3 and Thor, and WDC 2013 sold out in, wait for it, 71 seconds. This was unprecedented. It really showed that there was a problem here. The interest was beyond the capabilities of Apple's systems. iOS 7 was a huge, huge, huge release in the sense that it had this new flat idiom. We went from one visual idea of iOS to a radically different one. It was a major redesign in the platform ever done. You like it or not, that's another thing that has nothing to do with the choices made by Johnny Ive. There were lots of new frameworks to play with and a lot of new APIs. Most importantly, NSURL session. NSURL session came out right then, right there, and nobody cared because everybody was using AF networking anyway. Also importantly, yeah, more APIs. I mean, there's a lot of things. Another nice thing that happened was the change from Helvetica to Helvetica Neue. People complained a lot about that because seriously, it was very hard to read as a font. It looked probably very nice in the eyes of the designers, but not so good. I lowered the standard contract to $50 to attract customers. And the first movie featuring Ashton Kutcher, based on the biography of Steve Jobs, was released as well in August 2013. The iPhone 5S went to sale, and for the first time we have Touch ID and gold. You can buy not in white or black, but in gold. For the first time we have a new color. If you like it or not, that's another problem. But if you want more colors, you have the iPhone 5C, which was basically the same specs as the iPhone 5 with basically colored bumpers around them, and it was kind of fun. The iPad Air came out more or less at that time, providing the default look and feel that we see now even in the iPad Pro. And very importantly, the migration from iOS 6 to iOS 7 was incredibly fast and incredibly strong. And by December of 2013, 75% of all devices were running iOS 7. And Apple is making a shitload of money once again, almost 500,000 iPhones sold since day one, and there were 1 million apps on the App Store. By 2014, we got what? Go-to-fail. For those who remember, there was a really, really nasty bug caused by a go-to-fail, the go-to-fail statement that you see over there, here, as you can see, that basically was skipped in all code reviews, but caused literally the SSL handshake to fail and to transmit all of your data on the clear in the network. So it was really bad. Facebook bought another company, WhatsApp, this time for $19 billion. It's one of the highest acquisitions in the history of capitalism. By that time, the 9th and 10th movies of the MCU went out, and WWDC didn't sell out this time. Why? Because it was a lottery system. So basically, you put your name, and you get chosen to spend $1,500 on a ticket. The most important announcement by any standard in 2014 was, of course, Swift. It's a language that was type-safe, a language that with a strict typing, with a very slow compiler. That's a feature of the language, at least for the first version. And but interoperable to a certain level, interoperable with Objective-C and so on. iOS 8 in itself as well was the second biggest release in the history of iOS. The first was iOS 4. This one is iOS 8. iOS 8 is staggering the amount of new frameworks. Just to mention a couple of them: CloudKit, Metal, HomeKit, HealthKit, the PushKit, or the WebKit framework, which provided a new web view with the Nitro.js engine as well inside. Of course, iOS 8 is remembered as the extension version of iOS 8. All of a sudden, you have plenty of extensions to play with and to add to your applications so that they can become bigger and better. And IBM and Apple signed an agreement for working together. No, sorry, not this agreement, this agreement. They signed an agreement to basically work together and try to make apps for enterprise. So iOS was really becoming a very sought out system for enterprise applications. And there's now a lot of Fortune 500 companies that, for good or worse, use iOS instead of SAP. The iPhone 6 and 6 Plus came out. These were the first time that we had huge phablets, if you want, in the platform. Radical new design, a radical new screen size, and you'd better not be using absolute points by this time because your application would look really weird and bad. But one of the key characteristics of the iPhone 6 was that it bended. There was Bendgate, okay? People were complaining that if you put it on your back pocket and you sit on top of it for a couple of hours, you might have a bent iPhone, which seems logical, yet people complained about it as well. More or less at the same time, the Apple Watch was released, and Ballmer made its mea culpa.
With hindsight, are there things I'd do differently? Of course.
Like what?
Charlie, I probably would have started us doing hardware earlier so that we could have been more effective in the phone business.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of like an IQ test. Should Microsoft have a position in the phone business?
Yes.
The two most profitable companies. We were the #1 most profitable company in our business for a long time.
Right.
Two guys have passed us, and they both did it by making phones, Apple and Samsung.
There you go. That's very simple. So basically, the guy admitted that laughing at the very beginning of 2007 was probably not so much of a good idea. iOS 8 had a bit slower adoption, for those who remember, because it required 5 gigabytes of free space on your device. Now, it turns out that people take pictures like crazy. Many people don't back up those pictures, so there was no free space. Hence, you couldn't install iOS 8. This was solved by the following year. Nevertheless, 65% of all devices were running iOS 8 by the end of December. More or less at that time comes Carthage as well, which was the first alternative that came up for CocoaPods. And Swift became, in the Stack Overflow developer survey, the most loved language of that year as well. The most sought out, the one that people wanted to work with. They really didn't know what they were doing, did they? So by the end of 2014, Apple was making $183 billion. And as you can see, for the first time ever, the growth in the number of iPads sold basically didn't grow. The growth didn't grow. That doesn't sound very good. But basically, they were still selling a lot of devices. Who cares, right, at this point in time? 2015, it's all about Swift. Everybody was reinventing the wheel in Swift. The idea is take any project in Objective-C, write in Swift. It will look much better. It will earn you followers in GitHub. What else do you want? The second biography, this time with approval from the people at Apple and from the family of Steve Jobs came up, becoming Steve Jobs. The 11th and 12th movies of the MCU came out with Ant-Man being introduced as a character, and 2015, it's still a lottery. The most important announcement in WWDC 2015 was that Swift was going open source. This was a huge, huge thing. They introduced iOS 9 and watchOS 2, and we changed the font of the system from Helvetica Neue to San Francisco as well. Apple published an Android app. Very weird. All of a sudden, out of the blue, we have an Android app on the store to make what? To help users migrate from Android to iOS. And Apple became, and you cannot see there's a sequence of names of watchmakers there, but the sales of the Apple Watch were so good that they became the second seller of watches in the planet after Rolex, and right before Omega, Cartier, and so on. By that time, the iPhone 6s, which is the one that I have on my pocket, this is a 6s, not a 6s Plus, the normal 6s. It was the first device with 2 GB of RAM. Remember the first iPhone, it had 128. Now we have the devices with CPUs of almost 2 GHz in our pockets and 2 GB of RAM. And of course, the new feature that they brought that nobody uses is 3D Touch. More or less at that time came the iPad Air, the iPad Pro with the pencil and the keyboard, and trying to take iOS onto the desktop. For good or for worse, it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work for all use cases. For some people I know are very, very happy using an iPad. Some people, in my case in particular, it doesn't really work because we cannot write code on the machines as powerful as they are, because they have 4 gigs of RAM, 2.26 quad-core CPUs. Let us be very clear, first time in the iOS platform we have quad-core CPUs, and also at the end of 2015, Apple released a remote control that doesn't fucking work. At the end of the year as well, we had the second movie of the life of Steve Jobs, once again, and the fact of Swift being released on open source sparked the release of many open source frameworks for the server side that run on Linux and Mac OS X. So basically you can create web applications using Perfect, Vapor, Kitura, or Ziwo. And Kitura turns out to be a project from IBM. IBM has a vested interest now on Swift as a language to turn it into what I think will probably be the next Java. 75% of devices were running iOS 9 by the end of December 2015. And once again, Swift is one of the most loved programming languages. Apple is still making a shitload of money, and they are selling almost close to 1 billion iOS devices, not counting iPod Touches. 2016, last year, what happened in 2016? Well, lots of celebrities died for some reason, but in one of those celebrities was iAd, literally as well. WhatsApp announced 1 billion users, and in March, Apple announced the iPhone SE, which basically looks like the iPhone 5, and we have now a smaller iPad Pro, and there are the 13th and the 14th movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Instagram changed its icon. You know, because that's what you can do when you get $1 billion from Facebook. But in April, very importantly, Apple celebrated 40 years. It's kind of a milestone, right? For a company that actually has redefined in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s and the 2010s, has redefined computing in some particular way. I think it is quite an achievement to have a company that has stayed so long and so relevant. Of course, WW 2016 is still a lottery. It's actually a bingo, if you look at it closely. And we had Swift 3 and Xcode 8, which basically crash more often than ever. And we have new releases of watchOS, tvOS, and all of this system. And Mac OS X, now it's named Mac OS. So everything is something OS. Mac OS, tvOS, iOS, watchOS. The most important things of iOS 10, you have them there, particularly the CD framework. You can integrate CD finally in your applications somehow. And a couple of new APIs. And of course, instruments which gets a very nice visual memory leak stuff. Apple Pay, I didn't know why I put this slide here, I completely forgot. But Apple sells 1 billion phones. So remember the slide, a couple of slides previously when I showed that they were celebrating 1 million. Well, they celebrated 1 billion now. We are hoping in a couple of years to celebrate the trillionth. I don't know how it's going to be. iPhone 7 and iPhone 7 Plus as well came out, which were known very importantly. This is the device that was mostly famous because of not having a headphone jack, okay? And that requires courage, I guess. So that's how all this company is moving these days. There's a waterproof Apple Watch that's been released. Mozilla shut off Firefox OS. Actually, nobody was paying attention, so they kind of made a public statement. PR, whatever, 75% of devices were running iOS 10, and Apple was making still a shitload of money. However, the numbers are not growing anymore. They are not growing anymore, neither for the iPhone, neither for the iPad. But who cares? You have sold more than 1 billion devices of whatever the iPhone is, and you have 2 million iPhone apps and 1 million iPad apps on the store. What happened this year so far? A lot of things have happened. Very quickly, the product read iPhone, the Planet of the Apps. Planet of the Apps, remember the CNBC show from 2010? Now it's a reality show with all the celebrities that didn't die in 2016. That is Gwyneth Paltrow, will.i.am, and Jessica Alba, basically. And now it's a reality show. You can apply for it. Any of us can apply for it, and we can go, and then we can pitch our idea to will.i.am, and yeah, maybe you get a code review or something. I don't know. iOS 10.3.1 is the current version. This is where we are right now. iOS 10 is installed in 90% of all iOS devices as we speak in this very moment. And right now, the oldest device supported, as I said, is the iPhone 5. However, what we have, and this is the biggest thing that is happening right now, is the App Store blues. It's very hard for indie developers these days, both on the Mac and on the iOS platforms, to actually make a living out of the App Store. There's a race to the bottom in terms of prices. It's very hard to have a smashing hit, to at least to sell enough copies to pay your rent, or to actually pay for food, at least. And Matt Gemmell, a very well-known developer from the 2000s, wrote this piece a couple of days ago. This was last week, where basically he denounces the lack of incentives from Apple to create quality software, and the problems that the market in itself, the forces of the market that are beyond the control of Apple, have created a situation in which us, as developers, have very much, for the first time, we have trouble getting to the end of the month. I mean, unless you are an employee from a big corporation, that is. 2017 will not happen in San Francisco for the first time since 2002. And we're going to have new stuff, of course. Swift 4 without API. Maybe not, I don't know. Maybe a new Xcode, a new version of iOS, tvOS, macOS, watchOS, or whatever OS. And we're going to have a new beta of Xcode with a migration assistant for the new version of Swift. This, pretty much, I'm kind of sure that it's going to happen. There's going to be 3 new movies from the MCU, like seriously, the 15th, 17th, and 16th. What cannot keep up? I mean, they have television series on Netflix, everything. I mean, it's like impossible to follow up what's going on. Anyway, as we speak, the Apple stock is hovering 146. Remember the first slide that I showed, it was around $12. They've sold 1.16 billion iPhones. The numbers go more or less like this. And the total number of iPhones and iPads on a logarithmic graph look like this. It's quite a thing. Of course, not all of these devices are in use, because this takes into account the first iPhone as well. Yet, it is quite impressive to see the number of devices sold, starting from scratch, and also to see the impact in the mobile industry in terms of what were mobile devices before and after the iPhone came out. I raise now this question to you in terms of evolution. I think one of the interesting things of looking at the past is sometimes being able to see trends and to move forward. So I would like all of us developers to ask ourselves, where are we going with the App Store? I think that's the biggest question that we can all ask ourselves. Is this model viable? Is this sustainable? You know, as in sustainable economy. Can we still afford working on this model? Can Apple still afford? And if we don't agree with it, what are our ways to actually fight back and take control of our own code and of our own work as well in the future? Thank you so much. My name is Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. That was a really interesting talk, especially for a person who started in 2009.
Ah, there you go.
Do we have any questions? Anyone?
Who has been a developer since day one? Just very quickly. Who has been with the first iPhone Sdk? There we go. I have seen a few hands. One over there. Cool. Excellent. Yes. Question.
Yeah, so you've been to quite a few WWDC, which I'm sure quite a few of us are very jealous about. What is the thing that you most remember as the kind of like, oh my God moment?
Oh my God moment. I was telling that at some point. I was sitting in one of the presentations, and next to me was Marco Arment making comments about what was going on. And I was like, and then he was asking me, what do you think and everything. And I was like, can I talk to him? So there's this kind of moments where you meet up with, I don't know, Marcus Sarra, and you start having beers with Marcus Sarra, and at the third beer he starts telling you about multi-threading in core data, because that's what he knows, and he's very good at that. Or I met Daniel Steinberg, which is a very well-known author as well, a very good friend of all of us, and he basically telling me tips and tricks to, speak in public or to write books. And he actually introduced me to people who helped me publish my first books as well. So there's a lot of things going on when you go to these events. And I'm very sad that there is a lottery right now. On one side, I'm very happy because it makes for underrepresented groups easier to get in, which it's all for the credit for Apple for that. On the other side, there's a bit of nostalgia because you are part of a bunch of people. You meet there in San Francisco, you talk code, and it's cool, and there's always some spark and new ideas coming out. So yeah, I miss maybe that, yes. Who has been to WWDC from all of you here? Somebody? Ah, yeah, there you go. Quite a few. So I recommend that you apply. I mean, if I can actually give you a recommendation once, it's a very good idea to go there, to meet people, to see what's really going on, because Silicon Valley, whether we like it or not, is the heart of this industry. Everything happens there first. So being there is actually a very interesting experience enough just on itself. Good. Thank you so much.